Have you ever felt a connection so pure, so unexpected, it felt like a secret language only the two of you understood? A language built not on words, but on presence, on a shared silence, on a melody that came from somewhere deeper than sound? It was late October, the kind of damp, clinging cold that seeps into your bones long before winter truly announces itself. Rain hadn't fallen for days, but the air in the old, slightly neglected neighborhood hung heavy with the threat of it, smelling of wet earth, decaying leaves, and wood smoke that couldn't quite warm the streets. The sky was a bruised blanket of gray, pressing down on the rooftops, leaching the color from the world. Streetlights flickered on early, casting long, lonely shadows across the pavement. The year felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, or perhaps just waiting to end. Inside a small, rented duplex that still smelled faintly of unfamiliar cleaning products and the ghosts of other people's lives, Sarah felt that same grayness inside. It coated her thoughts, heavy and inert. 6 months. 6 months since the divorce papers were finalized, since she'd packed her life into boxes that felt too small to hold her confusion, and moved 3 states away. She wasn't running, she told herself. She was regrouping, finding space. But the space here felt vast and hollow, echoing with the absence of arguments that had become familiar, and the deeper, more terrifying absence of the love that had once underpinned them. Her job transfer was supposed to be a fresh start, but so far, it just felt like limbo. She moved through the rooms like a visitor, touching surfaces lightly, listening to the silence, which was the loudest sound of all. The only warmth came from the single, stubborn philodendron she'd brought with her, its leaves seeming to strain towards the weak afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains. She stood at the kitchen window now, a mug of cooling tea forgotten in her hands, staring out at the narrow strip of weedy backyard bordered by a tall, rickety wooden fence. The wind picked up, rattling the loose pane in its frame. A shiver, unrelated to the temperature, traced its way down her spine. Loneliness wasn't just an emotion for Sarah anymore. It was a physical sensation, a constant companion. It sat beside her on the worn sofa, echoed in the empty space across the tiny kitchen table, filled the passenger's seat of her car. It whispered in the quiet moments before sleep, reminding her of the life that wasn't hers anymore. The future felt like that gray sky outside, featureless, offering no horizon to aim for. She was adrift, untethered, and the worst part was, she wasn't even sure she had the energy left to care. Then movement. Faint, hesitant, at the very edge of her vision, near the overgrown lilac bush that hugged the corner of the fence. She blinked, focusing. At first, just a smudge of darker shadow against the damp earth. Then, the shadow resolved into a shape. Low to the ground, formatted and plastered in places, utterly still except for the faintest tremor that might have been the wind, or might have been the creature itself. A cat. A ginger cat, though the color was muted by grime and wet. Not particularly large, but not kitten small either. Just staring back at her window with eyes that seemed impossibly large and luminous in the gloom, a startling deep green. Sarah didn't move. She barely breathed. There was nothing overtly dramatic about the cat's appearance. No pitiful mewling, no obvious injury. It simply existed, a small, damp island of stillness in the neglected yard. Yet, something about its utter quietness, the intensity of that green gaze fixed on her window, pierced through the fog of her own numbness. It wasn't begging. It wasn't frightened. It just was. And in that simple, silent being, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. A fellow occupant of the gray space. There was a weariness in the set of its shoulders, a wariness in the way it held itself utterly motionless, as if movement might invite danger. Its left ear had a small, ragged notch, a tiny battle scar hinting at a life lived hard. Its fur, even wet and dirty, looked thick, suggesting it hadn't always been in this state. But now, it looked less like a stray, and more like something lost. Something profoundly alone. Time stretched. The cat didn't look away. Neither did Sarah. The grayness outside, the grayness inside, seemed to converge on this single point of connection through the glass. The wind sighed against the house. A single, sodden leaf detached from the lilac bush and spiraled slowly down. Sarah's knuckles were white on the mug. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, waiting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cat lowered its head. Not in submission, but as if gathering itself. Then, it took a single, deliberate step forward, out from the meager shelter of the lilac. Its movement was stiff, cautious. It paused, its green eyes never leaving Sarah's window. Another step. It was heading towards the rickety wooden steps that led up to her small back porch. Sarah's heart gave a strange, unexpected thump against her ribs. Not excitement, exactly. Not pity. It was something else, a stirring. A tiny, fragile shift in the heavy air of her isolation. This damp, silent creature, appearing in her neglected yard, felt less like an intrusion and more like the quietest possible beginning of something she couldn't name. The gray world held its breath, and in the stillness, Sarah felt a fragile thread of connection, thin as spider silk, but undeniably there. The thread, that impossibly fine strand of connection Sarah felt through the rain-streaked window, didn't snap. It held. And in the days that followed, it became the fragile scaffolding upon which a tentative, silent understanding began to build. A bridge between two solitary creatures navigating their own kinds of wilderness. She didn't rush it. Instinct, or perhaps just the residue of her own bruised caution, told her to move slowly, deliberately. The gray dampness persisted outside, a constant companion to the chill that still lingered within her. But now, there was a focal point, a purpose, small and specific, that pierced the fog, the ginger cat in her backyard. That first step onto the porch was merely investigative. Sarah didn't open the door, just watched through the glass. The cat, whom she'd started thinking of simply as Ginger in her head, a placeholder name until something more fitting emerged, didn't flee. He watched back. His green eyes, less startling now in the weak daylight but still piercingly intelligent, tracked her movements inside the kitchen. He didn't meow, didn't rub against the doorframe. He sat, a compact statue of matted fur and quiet vigilance, just beyond the top step, on the weathered boards of her small porch. The damp earth smell clung to him, mingling with the faint, sad scent of neglect. The next day, Sarah left a small, shallow bowl of water just outside the door. Tap water, nothing fancy. She placed it down with exaggerated slowness, then retreated immediately back inside, closing the door softly. She watched from the window. Ginger watched the bowl. Minutes passed. The wind ruffled his dirty fur. Then, with a deliberation that spoke of hard-learned caution, he approached. Not directly. A sideways shuffle, a pause, another shuffle. He sniffed the air above the bowl, then dipped his head, lapping once, twice, fastidiously, before retreating to his previous spot. He hadn't finished it, but he'd accepted it. It became a ritual. Water first. Then, emboldened by the lack of threat, a few days later, a small scoop of plain, dry kibble Sarah bought impulsively at the corner store. She'd never owned a cat. Her ex had been allergic. The kibble felt foreign in her hand, the rustling bag loud in the quiet morning. She scattered it near the water bowl. Ginger observed this new offering with intense scrutiny. He didn't touch it that day. Sarah felt a pang of foolishness, a familiar ache of rejection. Stupid, she thought. Asterisk, he's a stray. He doesn't trust you. Why would he? Asterisk, the gray feeling threatened to settle back in. But the next morning, the kibble was gone. And Ginger was back on the porch, sitting a little closer to the door this time, his posture less rigid. Hope, a fragile, flickering thing, sparked in Sarah's chest. She started talking to him, not expecting a response, just filling the silence that had become so oppressive. "Morning, Ginger," she'd murmur through the glass as she refreshed his water. "Bit chilly out there, isn't it?" She'd comment on the weather, the state of her philodendron, the blandness of her instant oatmeal. Mundane things, meaningless things. But spoken aloud, to another living presence, they felt different. Less hollow. He'd watch her mouth move, his ears twitching slightly, absorbing the sound. The breakthrough came on a particularly raw afternoon. A week after his first appearance. Rain had finally arrived. Not a downpour, but a cold, persistent drizzle that seeped into everything. Sarah had been sorting through a box labeled miscellaneous bedroom, a task she'd been avoiding. Inside, nestled under old scarves, was a framed photo. Her wedding day. Her younger self, radiant, clinging to the arm of a man whose face now looked like a stranger's. The happiness in that picture felt like a physical blow. A lie exposed by time. The carefully constructed walls around her grief cracked. Tears, hot and sudden, spilled over. She sank onto the cold linoleum floor, back against the kitchen cabinets, the photo face down beside her. She didn't sob, just wept silently, the kind of crying that comes from a deep well of exhaustion and loss. The gray world inside pressed in, suffocating. A soft sound, a thump, against the back door. Sarah startled, hastily wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. Ginger was there, pressed close against the glass. Not sitting, but standing, his nose almost touching the pane. His green eyes were fixed on her face, wide, unblinking. Not curious, not wary. Attentive. Intensely so. He made a sound, not a meow, but a low, almost inaudible chirp. A questioning sound. A concerned sound? He lifted one damp, muddy paw and placed it deliberately against the glass, right at the level where her cheek had been resting against the cabinet door. He held it there, a silent, impossible gesture of, what? Connection? Recognition? Sarah's breath hitched. The absurdity of it, the sheer, unlikely empathy radiating from this bedraggled creature on her porch, punctured her despair. A watery, disbelieving laugh escaped her. "Oh," she whispered, her voice thick. "Hey." She shuffled closer to the door, still sitting on the floor, so they were almost eye to eye through the glass. She lifted her own hand, mirroring him, pressing her palm flat against the cool pane opposite his paw. He didn't flinch. He just watched her, his gaze steady. The rain streaked down the glass between them, blurring the lines, but the connection felt sharper than ever. Solid. He understood sadness. He saw her. After that, something shifted. The invisible barrier thinned. Ginger began lingering longer on the porch. He'd napped there, curled tightly into a rusty orange comma on the faded welcome mat she'd never bothered to bring inside. Sarah started opening the inner door, leaving just the screen door between them. The scent of wet fur and damp earth drifted in, no longer unpleasant, just present. Alive. She'd sit on the floor just inside, reading a book or simply sipping tea, while he slept or watched the rain. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable, filled with the soft rhythm of his breathing, the occasional rustle as he shifted position, the hum of the old refrigerator. She learned his patterns. The way he'd arrive like a shadow just as dusk settled, the precise angle he'd sit to catch the last weak rays of sun on a rare clear afternoon, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that sometimes ran through him in his sleep. She started noticing the finer details beneath the grime. The thick ruff of fur around his neck, now slightly cleaner from his own ministrations. The surprising delicacy of his white paws, like little socks. The way his whiskers twitched when he was intently focused on a bird in the distant tree. And those eyes, pools of ancient, knowing green. They held a depth that unnerved her sometimes. He wasn't just a stray scavenging for food. There was history in his gaze, resilience, and a quiet intelligence that felt almost human. One evening, about 3 weeks after his first appearance, Sarah was sitting cross-legged on her side of the screen door, finishing a lukewarm bowl of soup. The air was finally crisp, the first real hint of autumn biting through the damp. Ginger was on the mat, meticulously cleaning a paw. He paused, looked up at her through the mesh. Then, he did something he'd never done before. He stood, stretched, long and slow, his back arching dramatically, then padded right up to the screen. Not to the edge, but directly in front of where she sat. He sat down, square, his tail wrapping neatly around his paws. He looked at her soup bowl, then directly into her eyes, and let out a soft, clear meow. Not demanding, not plaintive, just communicative. A statement. Asterisk, I am here. With you. Asterisk. Sarah smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that felt strange on her face. Yeah, she said softly. You are. She pushed the empty bowl aside. Ginger watched the movement, then lowered his head, resting his chin on his paws, his eyes drifting half-closed, but his body oriented completely towards her. Present. The space between them, filled only by the thin mesh of the screen, felt charged with a quiet, burgeoning trust. He wasn't inside, but he wasn't really outside either. He was In that moment, Sarah realized the gray fog inside her hadn't just lifted a little. It had been gently pushed aside by the quiet, persistent presence of a creature who understood silence and loneliness and the fragile beginnings of belonging. She reached out, slowly, and pressed her fingertips gently against the screen, right near where his shoulder rested. He didn't move away. He just let out a soft sigh, a sound of profound, unexpected peace. The connection wasn't through glass anymore. It was breath and warmth and a shared, unspoken understanding blooming in the twilight. The fragile thread had become a lifeline, quietly pulling her back towards the shore. The fragile peace, woven from shared silences and tentative trust through the screen door, deepened as autumn truly took hold. Crisp mornings painted the neglected yard with frost, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke. Inside Sarah's duplex, a quiet rhythm established itself, centered around the Ginger Sentinel on her porch. He was simply Ginger. The placeholder name had stuck, feeling right in its simplicity, a reflection of the uncomplicated, grounding presence he offered. He no longer waited for her to place food and retreat. He'd arrive with the fading light, a rust-orange shadow slipping from beneath the lilac bush, and settle on the welcome mat as Sarah opened the inner door. The screen remained the final barrier, but it felt increasingly symbolic. She'd sit on her side, he on his, sharing the twilight. She'd talk about her frustrating day at the new office, the awkwardness of small talk with neighbors, the persistent ache of memories that surfaced unexpectedly, like finding a forgotten sweater of his at the bottom of a box. Ginger listened, truly listened. His green eyes would fix on her face, his ears swiveling minutely, his body relaxed but attentive. Sometimes he'd let out a soft the sound that felt like acknowledgement. A quiet, "I hear you." One chilly Thursday evening, exhausted from a day filled with meaningless spreadsheets and the hollow echo of her own voice in meetings, Sarah found herself slumped on the floor inside the screen door. The gray feeling threatened, a familiar weight settling behind her eyes. Absent-mindedly, seeking some scrap of comfort, she began to hum. It was an old folk song her grandmother used to sing, a simple, lilting melody about lost love and finding your way home. It was rusty, barely audible, just a breath of sound escaping her lips as she stared at the worn pattern on the welcome mat Ginger occupied. Ginger, who had been drowsing, lifted his head. His ears pricked forward, not in alarm, but in intense focus. He watched her mouth. Sarah, lost in her own weariness, barely noticed. She hummed a few more bars, the melody wistful and fragile in the quiet room. Then it happened. A sound. Soft, tentative, almost hesitant, but clear. A single, pure note. Not a meow. Not a chirp. A musical note. It hung in the air, matching the pitch of her hum precisely. Sarah froze mid-breath. Her eyes snapped open wide, locking onto Ginger. He was looking directly at her, his mouth slightly open, his chest expanding. He did it again. Another note. Not the same note, but the next note in the simple melody she'd been humming. It wasn't perfect, there was a slight rasp, but the pitch was unmistakably correct. He tilted his head, a gesture that looked eerily like questioning? Encouragement? Her heart hammered against her ribs. Shock, pure, electric shock, coursed through her. "Ginger," she whispered, the name a breath. He blinked slowly, deliberately, his green eyes holding hers. Then, he offered another note. The third note of the fragment she'd hummed. A disbelieving laugh bubbled up in Sarah's throat, chased immediately by a wave of profound, unsettling wonder. "You sang?" Her voice trembled. This wasn't normal cat behavior. This wasn't anything she'd ever heard of. It felt impossible. Yet she'd heard it. Felt the vibration of the sound in the quiet space between them. The air crackled with the strangeness of it. Ginger simply held her gaze, serene, as if harmonizing with a human was the most natural thing in the world. He lowered his head back onto his paws, but his eyes remained watchful, alert. That moment became a turning point, not just in their connection, but in the atmosphere of Sarah's world. The unexplained melody hung in the air, a beautiful, haunting anomaly. It should have been joyful, this strange, shared song. And part of it was. A spark of pure, unadulterated wonder ignited in Sarah's chest. But intertwined with it, coiling like smoke, was a creeping sense of unease. The question echoed in the quiet after the notes faded. Why this cat? Why this song? It felt too deliberate, too knowing. It felt like a message she couldn't decipher. She began to experiment. Tentatively, almost afraid of breaking the spell, she'd hum another simple tune, a nursery rhyme, a snippet of a pop song from the radio. Ginger wouldn't always respond immediately. Sometimes he'd just watch, his eyes thoughtful. But sometimes, often when she was feeling particularly low or lost in thought, he'd offer a note. Always matching, always pure. Never a full melody, just a single, resonant tone that seemed to pierce through her fog. It became their secret language. A language of shared sound, of unspoken understanding. When the gray feeling pressed in too hard, a hum, and Ginger's answering note could sometimes lift it just a fraction. It was a comfort, but a comfort wrapped in mystery. Simultaneously, another pattern emerged, one that cast a different kind of shadow. Sarah decided it was time. Time to stop living out of boxes. Time to unpack the spare bedroom, the one she'd been using as a dumping ground for all the things she couldn't bear to look at. The room that held the physical remnants of her failed marriage. She opened the door one Saturday morning, the smell of dust and stale air washing over her. Boxes were stacked haphazardly. A forlorn armchair draped with an old quilt. The gray light filtering through the single window did little to lift the room's oppressive feel. She brought Ginger inside for the first time. The screen door barrier finally crossed. He'd been cautiously exploring the kitchen and living room over the past week, sniffing corners, rubbing his cheek tentatively against the leg of her sofa, claiming small spaces. He'd seemed curious, accepting. She thought he might like the quiet of the spare room, a new space to investigate. She carried him in, feeling the warm, solid weight of him in her arms, his purr a soft rumble against her chest. She set him down gently on the dusty carpet near the doorway. "All right, explorer," she murmured. "New territory." Ginger took a tentative step forward, sniffing the air. His tail was held high, a flag of cautious interest. He moved towards the nearest box, sniffed it thoroughly. Then he turned, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes landed on the draped armchair in the corner, and he froze. Utterly, completely frozen. The purring stopped. His tail lowered, then tucked itself tightly against his body. His ears flattened back against his skull, not in anger, but in pure, unadulterated fear. A low growl, a sound Sarah had never heard from him, vibrated deep in his throat. It wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the room. At the chair. "Ginger?" Sarah said, startled. "What's wrong, buddy?" He didn't look at her. His wide, terrified eyes were fixed on the armchair, as if he saw something monstrous lurking in its shadowed folds. His body tensed, every muscle coiled. Then, with a sudden, panicked scramble, he bolted. Not towards the door, but away from the chair, deeper into the room, towards the far wall. He pressed himself flat against the baseboard, his sides heaving, a thin, high-pitched whine escaping him. He looked cornered, traumatized. Sarah's heart clenched. Hey, it's okay." She moved towards him slowly, hands outstretched, voice soothing. "It's just a chair, Ginger. Just an old chair." But her words felt hollow. His terror was visceral, real. This wasn't a reaction to a strange object. This was memory. Raw, painful memory imprinted on his very being. He wouldn't let her touch him. When she got within a few feet, he hissed, a sharp, defensive sound, his eyes wild. Sarah stopped, stunned. This wasn't her Ginger. This was a creature possessed by a ghost she couldn't see. She retreated slowly, opening the door wide. Okay, you can go. It's all right. Go." It took him a full minute. He remained pressed against the wall, trembling, his gaze darting between Sarah and the dreaded armchair. Then, in a sudden, desperate blur, he shot past her legs, through the doorway, across the living room, and vanished out the barely open kitchen window he'd learned to use. Sarah stood alone in the spare room doorway, the scent of dust and fear hanging heavy in the air. The beautiful mystery of his song, the profound comfort of his presence, now collided violently with this raw, unexplained terror. What happened in this room? Or in a room like this? What or who did that armchair represent to him? The connection she cherished suddenly felt fragile, fraught with hidden currents she didn't understand. He didn't come back that night. Sarah sat by the open screen door until the cold drove her inside, calling his name softly into the darkness, her earlier resolve to unpack the room utterly forgotten. The untouched boxes seemed to loom larger, the draped armchair a silent sentinel of some unknown horror. The haunting melody he'd sung now felt intertwined with this new terror. The comfortable rhythm was shattered. The warmth of their bond was chilled by a fear she couldn't name, a history written in a language of flatted ears, a low growl, and eyes wide with the memory of pain. The mystery of Ginger had deepened, twisting into something shadowed, and Sarah felt the first cold fingers of dread brush against her heart. Who was this cat, and what silent storm of the past had washed him up, singing, onto her neglected porch? The comforting presence had become a poignant question mark, wrapped in orange fur, and trembling with secrets. The silence that followed Ginger's panicked flight wasn't the comfortable quiet Sarah had grown used to. It was a vacuum, thick with shock, fear, and the echo of that terrible, guttural growl. The spare room doorway felt like the mouth of a cave, dark and breathing out the cold scent of dust and forgotten sorrow. She stood there for a long time, staring at the draped armchair. It wasn't just furniture anymore. It was an accusation, a cipher, a silent repository of whatever horror had shattered Ginger's peace so completely. He didn't return that night, or the next. Sarah left food and water on the porch, untouched. The kibble grew stale in the crisp air. The water bowl collected fallen leaves. Each evening, she sat by the open screen door, wrapped in a blanket against the deepening autumn chill, calling his name softly into the gathering dusk. "Ginger? Come on, buddy, is it please?" Her voice cracked, swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness. The familiar ache of loneliness returned, but sharper now, laced with a new, gnawing guilt. She had brought him into that room. She had triggered that primal terror. The fragile trust she'd nurtured, the shared melodies, felt like a dream dissolving in cold daylight. The grayness inside wasn't just fog now, it was a crushing weight. Had she lost him? Had she pushed too hard, shattered something irreplaceable? 3 days crawled by. 3 days of jumping at every rustle in the yard, of waking in the pre-dawn stillness, straining to hear a familiar chirp that never came. 3 days of the armchair looming in her peripheral vision, its draped shape seeming to mock her from the spare room doorway she now kept firmly closed. The unpacking project was abandoned. The room became a tomb, sealed shut. On the 4th evening, rain returned. A heavy, relentless downpour that hammered on the roof, lashed against the windows, turned the neglected backyard into a quagmire. Sarah sat on the floor inside the screen door, not expecting him, just staring out at the gray sheets of water, feeling utterly hollow. The storm outside mirrored the one within. She hadn't hummed since that night. The thought of music felt like a betrayal. What good were shared notes when the foundation of their connection lay shattered? Then, a flicker of movement. A sodden, bedraggled shape, barely discernible through the rain, emerged from beneath the dripping lilac bush. Ginger. He looked smaller, diminished. His fur plastered flat, his tail low. He hesitated at the edge of the porch, looking not at the food bowl, but directly at the screen door, at Sarah huddled behind it. His green eyes, even from a distance, looked huge, haunted, and filled with a profound weariness that cut Sarah to the core. He took a tentative step onto the porch, then another. He didn't go near the stale kibble. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the screen door, stopping just inches from it. Rainwater streamed off his matted fur. He lifted his head, meeting Sarah's gaze through the mesh. There was no fear now, only a deep, abiding sadness and a question. A silent plea. Sarah's breath caught. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes. She scrambled forward on her knees, pressing her palms flat against the screen. "Ginger," she choked out, her voice raw. "Oh, Ginger, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The dam broke. Sobs racked her body, tears blurring her vision, the guilt and worry and sheer relief of seeing him crashing over her in waves. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her breath until it escaped in ragged gasps. Ginger watched her cry. He didn't move away. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, soaked and shivering, his gaze unwavering, holding hers through the screen and the rain and her tears. It was the same intense, witnessing presence he'd offered when she'd wept over the wedding photo, but magnified 100-fold. He saw her anguish, her remorse, her raw, unfiltered pain. And he didn't flinch. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted a muddy, trembling paw. He placed it against the screen, directly opposite where her hand pressed from the inside. A mirror image of their first profound connection. The gesture was so simple, so impossibly tender, it shattered Sarah completely. A fresh wave of sobs tore through her. She leaned her forehead against the cool mesh, her tears mingling with the raindrops streaking down the other side. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words barely audible over the drumming rain. "I didn't know it would hurt you." Ginger pressed his paw more firmly against the screen. He held it there. A point of contact. A bridge across the storm. His green eyes, deep pools of ancient sorrow, held hers. There was understanding in them. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but an acknowledgement of shared pain. He knew grief. He recognized it in her. And in this moment, his own terror momentarily set aside, he offered the only comfort he could, silent, unwavering presence. The raw intensity of the moment, the shared vulnerability, unlocked something desperate inside Sarah. She couldn't live with the unknown shadowing them. She couldn't let that room, that chair, remain a source of terror. Ginger was back, battered but here, offering connection even after she'd caused him pain. She had to face it. For him. For herself. "I have to know, Ginger," she whispered, her voice thick but resolute. She lifted her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I have to see what's in there." She looked towards the closed door of the spare room, then back at him. Will you stay? Please? Just stay." Ginger didn't move his paw. He blinked slowly, a deliberate, almost human gesture of assent, or perhaps resignation. He lowered his head slightly, but kept his eyes fixed on her. He wouldn't run. Not this time. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Sarah pushed herself up. Her legs felt weak. She walked towards the spare room door, her hand trembling as she turned the cold brass knob. The click echoed loudly in the sudden quiet of the house, the rain outside the only sound. She pushed the door open, the smell of dust and stale air rushing out. She didn't turn on the overhead light. The gray storm light filtering through the single window was enough, casting long, distorted shadows. Her eyes went immediately to the draped armchair. It sat hulking in the corner, the old quilt thrown carelessly over it, concealing its shape. Sarah approached it slowly, every nerve ending screaming. Ginger's terror was a palpable memory in the room. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough, faded fabric of the quilt. It smelled of mothballs and neglect. With a sudden surge of courage, or desperation, she grabbed the edge and yanked it off. Dust motes exploded into the dim light, dancing like frantic ghosts. The armchair was revealed. It was old, upholstered in a faded, floral pattern that had once been cheerful. The fabric was worn thin on the arms, stained in places. It looked ordinary, forgotten, nothing monstrous. But Sarah remembered Ginger's reaction. His absolute terror had been focused here. She knelt beside it, running her hands over the arms, the seat cushion, searching for what? A stain? A hidden compartment? Nothing. Just dust and worn fabric. Frustration warred with relief. Maybe it was just a chair. Maybe his fear was a random association, a sound, a smell, unrelated to the object itself. She slumped back onto her heels, defeated. Her hand resting on the seat cushion, pressed down slightly. There was an odd lump, not in the cushion itself, but under it, near the back. Hardly noticeable unless you were searching. Her pulse quickened. She lifted the heavy cushion. Beneath it, tucked into the gap between the cushion and the chair back, was a small bundle. Not hidden deliberately, more like hastily shoved out of sight and forgotten. Her hands shook as she pulled it out. It was a thick cream-colored envelope, old and slightly yellowed at the edges. It wasn't sealed. Tucked inside were several folded sheets of lined paper, covered in dense, looping handwriting. The ink was faded, blue bleeding into the paper fibers. The top sheet bore a date, scrawled in the corner, nearly 2 years old, and a name, Eleanor. Sarah sank onto the dusty floor beside the chair, her back against its worn flank. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the window. She unfolded the first letter, her eyes scanning the opening lines, and the breath left her body. "My dearest Thomas," it began. "Another Sunday afternoon in this too quiet house. The rain keeps falling, just like it did the day you left for the hospital, promising it was just tests. I sit in your chair, the one you always loved for reading the paper, because it still smells faintly of your pipe tobacco, and sometimes if I close my eyes tight enough, I can almost feel the weight of you beside me." The letter unfolded a love story, a long, deeply woven marriage, abruptly severed. Thomas Henderson, the previous tenant, the frail old man Mrs. Wilkins from next door had mentioned only in passing months ago. Kept to himself, passed peacefully in his sleep. But Eleanor's letters, written after his death, spoke a different truth. They spoke of a sudden, devastating diagnosis, of hope cruelly extinguished, of the agonizing emptiness of coming home to a house echoing with absence. She wrote of sitting in this chair, Thomas's chair, because it was the closest she could get to him. She wrote of her grief, raw and unvarnished, her struggle to eat, to sleep, to find a reason to keep breathing. She wrote of the crushing loneliness, the silence that screamed, the way the smallest things, his slippers by the door, the way the light fell in the afternoon, could reduce her to rubble. Sarah read, tears streaming down her face unchecked now, not for her own lost marriage, but for Eleanor's profound, shattering loss. The words resonated with a terrible familiarity. The gray weight, the suffocating silence, the feeling of being adrift in a world that had fundamentally shifted. Eleanor had poured her heart out onto these pages, letters to a ghost, seeking solace in the only place that still held his essence, his chair. The final letter, dated just a few weeks before the duplex was listed for rent, was the shortest. The handwriting shakier. "Thomas, my darling, the house is sold. They say I must go live with Marjorie near the coast. She means well, but it feels like another leaving. Another loss. I went to pack your chair today to have it shipped. But when I touched it, sat in it one last time, I couldn't. It felt like packing you away in a box. Like saying goodbye all over again. So I left it. I left your chair right here, in this room that was always yours. Covered it with that old quilt, the one we used on picnics. Maybe someone else will sit in it someday. Maybe they'll need it. It still holds the shape of you, the memory of us. Forgive me for leaving it, for leaving this place where we were happy. The silence here is too loud now. But the silence at Marjorie's, I fear it will be a different kind of quiet. One without even the echo of you. Goodbye, my love. Wait for me." Sarah lowered the letter, her vision blurred. She understood now. Understood Ginger's terror with devastating clarity. He hadn't been afraid of the chair. He'd been afraid for the person who'd sat in it. Eleanor. His person. He must have belonged to Eleanor. He'd witnessed her grief, her tears, her utter desolation as she sat in this very spot, writing these raw, aching letters to her lost Thomas. He'd absorbed her pain, her fear, the palpable aura of sorrow that clung to this room, to this chair. When Sarah brought him in, the smell, the energy, the overwhelming memory of Eleanor's anguish had flooded back, a tidal wave of remembered trauma. He hadn't seen a monster. He'd seen, and felt, the ghost of his beloved owner's profound heartbreak. A soft sound, a rustle at the doorway. Sarah looked up, her face wet with tears. Ginger stood there. Not on the porch. Inside the house. He must have slipped in through the kitchen window. He was still damp, but he'd licked some of the mud from his fur. He stood at the threshold of the spare room, his body tense, but not frozen. His green eyes were fixed on her, then flickered to the chair, then back to her face. He saw the letters in her lap, saw her tears. He didn't growl. He didn't hiss. He took a single, cautious step into the room. Then another. His movements were stiff, wary, but purposeful. He walked past the chair, giving it a wide berth, his gaze lingering on it with a look of profound sadness, not fear. He walked directly towards Sarah, curled up on the dusty floor beside the source of so much remembered pain. He stopped right beside her. He looked down at the letters, then up into her wet, red-rimmed eyes. He understood. He knew what she held. He knew the sorrow etched on those pages. He knew the scent of that grief, because he'd breathed it in day after day with Eleanor. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head. He didn't nuzzle her hand. He pressed the top of his head, the space between his ears, firmly against her knee. A solid, warm pressure. A gesture of shared sorrow. A silent acknowledgement. I know this pain. I remember. Sarah reached out a trembling hand, not to pick him up, but to gently rest it on his head. His fur was still slightly damp, cool under her fingers. He leaned into her touch, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping him. It wasn't a purr. It was a sound of release, of letting go, of finally being understood. The rain lashed against the window. The dusty room held the ghosts of two profound losses. But on the floor, amidst the boxes and the echoes of Eleanor's grief, a woman and a cat sat together. Connected not just by shared loneliness, but by the deep, resonant understanding of heartbreak. Sarah cried, quiet tears now, For Eleanor, for Thomas, for her own lost dreams, and for the small, brave creature who had loved someone through the darkest silence, and now offered that same fierce, quiet loyalty to her. Ginger kept his head pressed against her knee, a warm, living anchor in the storm of memory. The mystery hadn't been solved, it had been shared. The breaking point wasn't an end, it was a raw, open doorway into a deeper, more painful, yet profoundly real connection. In the dusty twilight, amidst the remnants of other people's lives, they found each other not despite the pain, but because of it. The haunting melody of loss had finally found its harmony. The rain outside softened to a gentle patter, then ceased altogether, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a sliver of moon that pierced the retreating clouds. Inside the spare room, the silence felt different now. Not oppressive, but sacred. Heavy with the weight of stories told and sorrows shared, yet somehow lighter. Sarah sat on the dusty floorboards. Ginger's warmth had a solid, grounding pressure against her knee. Eleanor's letters resting gently in her lap like fragile paper birds. The raw storm of tears had passed, leaving her hollowed out, but strangely clear. The air, thick with dust and decades of quiet heartache, seemed to shift as if exhaling. Ginger stirred first. He lifted his head, his green eyes meeting hers in the dim light. The haunted terror was gone, replaced by a profound, weary sadness and something else. Acceptance. He blinked slowly, deliberately, then nudged her hand with his damp nose. Not demanding, just present. We're here. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of dust and damp fur and the faint, lingering scent of old paper and grief. She carefully folded Eleanor's letters, smoothing the creased pages with a tenderness she hadn't known she possessed. They weren't hers. They were whispers from another life, echoes of a love and loss that mirrored her own, but belonged to a stranger, and to the cat who had witnessed it all. She slipped them back into their faded envelope, her fingers tracing the name Eleanor. "What do we do with this, Ginger?" she whispered, her voice raspy from crying. She looked at the armchair, no longer a monster, but a monument. A vessel holding the ghost of Thomas Henderson and the tangible, aching love of his widow. The quilt lay crumpled on the floor where she dropped it, the faded picnic pattern a cruel contrast to its recent shroud. Ginger followed her gaze to the chair. He didn't flinch, didn't growl. He simply looked at it, his expression unreadable, ancient. Then he turned his head, pressing it back against her knee, a silent plea to leave this place of remembered pain. Sarah understood. She pushed herself up, her muscles stiff and aching, the letters held carefully in one hand. She offered her other hand, palm down, to Ginger. He sniffed it, and after a moment's hesitation, bumped his head against her fingers. Permission, trust, tentatively reaffirmed. She led the way out of the spare room, leaving the door open behind them, a symbolic act. She wouldn't seal the tomb again. The light from the living room felt almost harsh after the dimness. Sarah placed Eleanor's envelope on her small, cluttered kitchen table, a decision deferred. Ginger padded silently beside her, his tail held low but not tucked, his steps hesitant but no longer panicked. He went directly to his water bowl on the porch, lapping deeply, the sound loud in the quiet house. Then he returned, not to the welcome mat, but to the rug just inside the screen door, and began the meticulous, calming ritual of cleaning his damp fur, starting with his muddy paws. Sarah watched him, a lump forming in her throat. The simple act, so ordinary, felt like a miracle. He was back. He was here. Not just physically, but emotionally present again. The fragile thread hadn't snapped. It had been strained, almost to breaking, but it held. She filled his food bowl with fresh kibble, the simple, nourishing sound of the pellets hitting the ceramic a grounding counterpoint to the emotional tempest they just weathered. He paused his grooming, looked at the bowl, then at her, and gave a soft, almost imperceptible murmur before resuming his task. He'd eat when he was ready, on his own terms. The trust was rebuilding brick by fragile brick. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, profound shift. Autumn deepened, painting the neighborhood in fiery hues, the air crisp and smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The neglected backyard, viewed through the kitchen window, seemed less like a symbol of Sarah's stagnation and more like a space holding potential, waiting. Sarah didn't rush back into the spare room. She gave it space and gave Ginger space. But she didn't ignore it either. One sunny afternoon, with Ginger drowsing in a patch of sunlight on the living room rug, Sarah ventured back in, not to unpack her own boxes, but to tend to Eleanor's. She carefully folded the old picnic quilt, its faded patterns whispering of happier times, and draped it over the back of the sofa in the living room. It felt right, bringing a piece of Eleanor's story, her love, out of the shadows. Then she approached the armchair, Thomas's chair. She ran her hand over the worn floral upholstery, no longer with trepidation, but with reverence. She could almost feel the imprint of him, the ghost of pipe smoke, the weight of Eleanor's grief as she sat here writing. Sarah didn't sit in it. Not yet. Instead, she gently began to clean it, brushing away layers of dust, wiping the wooden arms with a soft cloth, fluffing the flattened cushions. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about honoring it, caring for it. As she worked to Ginger, but to the room, perhaps to Thomas. "Eleanor loved you very much, Thomas," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "She couldn't bear to pack you away. She left you here, hoping someone might need you." She smoothed the fabric over a small tear in the seat cushion. "I don't know if I need you, but I see you now. I see her." Ginger appeared in the doorway. He watched her, his green eyes thoughtful. "Come." He didn't enter, but he didn't retreat. He sat just beyond the threshold, his tail curled neatly around his paws, a silent guardian, a witness to this act of quiet restoration. Sarah's own unpacking began, slowly, tentatively. Not with the frantic energy of escape, but with a new sense of purpose. She started with the boxes labeled kitchen, then books. Things that held no sharp edges of her past marriage. She created space. She hung a picture on the bare living room wall, a print of a windswept coast. Somewhere Eleanor might have gone to live with Marjorie. She bought a second-hand reading lamp, placing it beside the armchair, as if preparing it for use. Ginger's routines solidified, but they changed too. He still arrived at dusk, but now he often slipped through the kitchen window directly, padding silently into the living room. He explored more freely, claiming new spots. The corner of the sofa, the sun-warmed patch beneath the coast print, the rug beside Sarah's own reading chair. He still spent time on the porch, but it was no longer his sole domain. He was integrating, tentatively claiming the inside world. The singing, their secret language, returned. But differently. It wasn't Sarah initiating it out of her own sadness anymore. Sometimes, she'd be washing dishes, lost in thought, and a soft, pure note would drift from the living room where Ginger lay curled. A single tone, resonant, peaceful. She'd stop and see him watching her, his eyes half closed in contentment, She'd hum back a note, not a melody, just a harmonic response. "I hear you. I'm here." It was no longer a mystery wrapped in unease, but a comfort, a shared pulse, a quiet affirmation of their bond, forged stronger in the crucible of shared understanding. One crisp Saturday morning, Sarah stood in the spare room doorway. Her own boxes were mostly unpacked now, the room transformed from a dumping ground into a functional, if still sparse, space. Books lined a shelf. A small desk stood under the window. Only Thomas's armchair remained, sitting in its corner, clean now, the faded floral pattern a testament to time and love. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah walked over to the chair. She ran her hand along its back, feeling the smooth, worn wood. Then, taking a deep breath, she sat down. Not tentatively, but deliberately. The cushion sighed softly beneath her weight. It was comfortable, solid. She looked out the window at the fiery maple tree in the neighbor's yard. She thought of Eleanor, writing her letters here, pouring her grief onto the page. She thought of Thomas, reading his paper. She thought of her own journey, the loneliness, the unexpected arrival of a broken, singing cat, the shattering fear, and the raw, healing connection that followed. Ginger appeared in the doorway. He looked at her, sitting in the chair. His tail gave a single, slow, deliberate swish. Not agitation, assessment. Then he walked into the room, not skirting the chair, but approaching it directly. He stopped beside it, looked up at Sarah, and blinked slowly, deliberately. "I see you." Then he did something extraordinary. He didn't jump onto her lap. He didn't rub against the chair legs. He walked a few paces away to a patch of sunlight on the newly vacuumed rug and settled down. He curled up, tucking his nose under his tail, his body relaxed, his eyes closing. He wasn't guarding her. He wasn't wary. He was simply resting, peacefully, in the same room as the chair that had once held only terror. Sarah leaned back in Thomas's chair. Eleanor's chair, her chair now. The worn fabric held her, not the ghosts of the past, but the quiet strength of survival. She watched Ginger sleep, the sunlight turning his fur into molten copper. The silence in the room wasn't empty, wasn't heavy. It was peaceful, filled with the soft rhythm of his breathing, the distant call of a crow, the gentle hum of the furnace kicking on. The mystery hadn't vanished, the sadness of Eleanor's letters, the echo of her own lost love, they were still there. But they were integrated, part of the tapestry, not jagged shards threatening to wound. She'd come here untethered, lost in gray. She'd found a creature equally lost, singing notes of unexplained beauty and carrying the weight of unseen trauma. Together, they'd faced the shadow in the spare room, not with a sword, but with tears and understanding and the quiet courage to sit with pain. The chair wasn't just furniture. It was a testament to love lost, to grief endured, and to the unexpected ways life and creatures mend. Ginger's peaceful presence on the rug, the soft sunlight, the clean, quiet room, it felt like a quiet victory. Not a triumphant fanfare, but a deep, resonant chord of peace settling over them both. The storm had passed. What remained wasn't the landscape they'd known before, but a new one, softer, scarred, yet fundamentally whole. They were no longer just sharing a porch or a house. They were sharing the quiet, resilient aftermath. And it was enough. More than enough. It was home. Winter arrived not with a blizzard, but with a gradual, insistent chill that frosted the windows overnight and turned the neglected backyard into a monochrome etching of bare branches and frost-whitened grass. The fiery autumn blaze was gone, replaced by a stark, beautiful stillness. Inside Sarah's duplex, a different kind of quiet reigned, a peaceful, lived-in quiet, punctuated by the soft ticking of the old radiator, the rustle of turning pages, and the rhythmic purr emanating from a ginger cat curled in a tight, warm circle on the faded floral cushion of Thomas Henderson's armchair. Sarah sat in her own reading chair nearby, a mug of steaming tea warming her hands. She watched Ginger sleep, the rise and fall of his flank a steady metronome in the afternoon calm. Sunlight, pale and weak but precious, streamed through the window, gilding the edges of his fur and illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air above Eleanor's quilt draped over the sofa. The spare room was now her study, functional, uncluttered, holding only the desk, the bookshelf, and Thomas's chair, which Ginger had claimed as his official throne. The terror was a memory softened by time and understanding. It was his place of deepest comfort now. The envelope containing Eleanor's letters still sat on Sarah's desk. She hadn't opened it again since that rainy night of revelation, but its presence was a constant, gentle weight. She knew she couldn't keep them. They weren't hers. They were a heart laid bare, entrusted to the silence of a room, found by accident, and by a cat who had loved the heart that broke. The question wasn't if she would return them, but how. One morning, bundled against the cold, Sarah took a walk. Not her usual route to the corner store, but a purposeful stroll towards the slightly grander houses at the end of her street. She remembered Mrs. Wilkins, the neighbor who'd mentioned the previous tenant only in passing. She found the woman meticulously sweeping her front porch, despite the frost. Mrs. Wilkins? Hi, it's Sarah from the Hendersons' old duplex. The woman peered over her glasses, her breath puffing white in the air. Oh yes, Sarah. Keeping warm? Nippy out. It is, Sarah agreed, shifting her weight. But I wondered if you might remember more about Mrs. Henderson? Eleanor? You mentioned she moved to live with her sister, Marjorie? Near the coast. Mrs. Wilkins leaned on her broom, her expression softening with memory. Eleanor is lovely woman. Quite devastated when Thomas passed. Just hollowed out. Took it so hard. Marjorie, that's her sister, she came to help pack things up. Worried sick about Eleanor being alone in that big house with all the memories. Rightly so. She sighed. Eleanor didn't want to go. Fought it quietly. But she wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. Marjorie was firm. Said the sea air would do her good. Broke her heart to leave, though. Especially. Mrs. Wilkins trailed off, her gaze drifting towards Sarah's duplex. Especially what? Sarah prompted gently, her heart thumping. The cat, Mrs. Wilkins said, her voice dropping slightly. Poor creature. Eleanor doted on him. Marmalade, she called him. Sweetest thing. Followed her everywhere. When Thomas was ill, that cat barely left his side. Then, after, he was Eleanor's shadow. Her comfort. She shook her head sadly. But Marjorie, she's terribly allergic. Asthmatic. Couldn't have a cat in the house. Eleanor was beside herself. Tried finding him a home locally, but he was older, set in his ways, and frankly, after Thomas died, he got a bit skittish. Didn't take to strangers. Nobody wanted him. The day they left. Mrs. Wilkins's eyes grew misty. I saw them drive off. Eleanor was crying, holding a little cat carrier, but it was empty. She'd opened the door, let Marmalade out in the backyard just before they left. Just set him free. Said she couldn't bear taking him to a shelter, hoped someone kind might find him. Marjorie was fussing, worried they'd miss their train. It was awful. Heartbreaking. I tried leaving food out for a while, but I never saw hide nor hair of him after that. I assumed. She didn't finish, just gave Sarah a look heavy with unspoken sorrow. Marmalade. The name echoed in Sarah's mind, sweet and poignant. Ginger. Marmalade. The pieces clicked with a final resonant certainty. The skittishness. The fear. The profound sadness in his eyes. He hadn't just witnessed Eleanor's grief, he'd shared it. He'd been her lifeline, and then he'd been set adrift. Abandoned not out of lack of love, but because of it. Left behind in the yard filled with memories of Thomas and Eleanor and the life he'd known. How long had he huddled under that lilac bush? How many seasons had passed before Sarah, another soul adrift, had seen his green eyes through the rain-streaked glass? "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins," Sarah managed, her throat tight. "Thank you so much." She turned and walked back towards her duplex, the cold air suddenly sharper, the story of the cat on her porch now unbearably complete. He wasn't just a stray. He was Marmalade. He was Eleanor's last, desperate act of love and her deepest sorrow. Back inside, Ginger, Marmalade, was sitting upright in his chair, watching the backyard with quiet intensity. Sarah knelt beside him, the frosty window pane cold against her forehead as she looked out at the bare lilac bush. She thought of Eleanor, heartbroken, opening the carrier door. She thought of Marmalade, bewildered, watching the car drive away, taking his world with it. "Marmalade," she whispered, testing the name. His ear twitched. He turned his head slowly, those deep green eyes meeting hers. There was no shock of recognition to the name, just his usual calm, knowing gaze. But Sarah felt the shift. He had a history now. A name given with love. A life before the gray porch and the shared silence. The letters felt even heavier now. She retrieved the envelope from her desk. Holding it, she felt the weight of Eleanor's anguish and the echo of her impossible choice. Returning them wasn't just the right thing. It felt necessary. A closing of the circle. Using the details Mrs. Wilkins provided and a bit of online searching, Sarah found an address for Marjorie Henderson, Eleanor's sister, in a small coastal town several hours away. She didn't send the letters immediately. She sat with them for a few days, with Marmalade often curled beside her on the sofa, purring softly. One quiet evening, she took out a sheet of her own paper. "Dear Marjorie, my name is Sarah. I live in the duplex your sister, Eleanor, rented after Thomas passed. I hope this letter finds you both well and that the sea air brings Eleanor some comfort. I'm writing because I found something in the house, a bundle of letters Eleanor wrote to Thomas. They were tucked away, perhaps accidentally left behind. They are deeply personal, filled with her love for Thomas and her profound grief after losing him. Reading them, I felt the immense weight of her sorrow and the strength of the love that caused it. I also wanted to tell you, I found Marmalade." Sarah paused, her pen hovering. How to explain? She kept it simple. He found his way to the backyard last autumn. He was thin, wary, and carried a deep sadness. It took time and patience, but he's safe now. He lives with me. He's warm, well-fed, and deeply loved. He has a favorite chair, Thomas's old one, I believe, and a purr that could mend cracks in stone. He's still Marmalade, just perhaps a little more ginger on the outside. I believe he remembers Eleanor. There's a knowing in his eyes. Finding her letters helped me understand his fear, his history. He witnessed her heartbreak and then endured his own loss when he was left behind. I cannot imagine how difficult that decision was for Eleanor. Please tell her I understand it came from love and a hope for his safety. I am enclosing Eleanor's letters. They belong with her. They are a testament to a great love and to the courage it takes to grieve so deeply. Thank you for letting me glimpse her heart. And thank you for letting Marmalade find his way to me. He has been a light in my own gray season. With respect, Sarah and Marmalade. She carefully placed Eleanor's letters inside a larger, sturdy envelope with her own note, sealed it, and addressed it. The act felt momentous, releasing the past, honoring Eleanor's story, affirming Marmalade's journey. Weeks passed. The first real snow fell, transforming the neglected yard into a pristine, sparkling blanket. Marmalade watched the falling flakes from his chair throne, mesmerized. Sarah sat beside him on the floor, leaning against the armrest, a book open but unread in her lap. The radiator hissed softly. The world outside was muffled, peaceful. Absently, softly, Sarah began to hum. Not the folk song she'd hummed that first time, but a simple, wordless melody that rose from a place of quiet contentment. A sigh of warmth in the winter stillness. Marmalade stirred. He turned his head from the window, his green eyes finding hers. He listened for a moment, his ears pricked forward. Then he opened his mouth. Not a meow, not a chirp. A single, pure, resonant note. It hung in the air, perfectly matching the pitch of her hum. Beautiful, hauntingly familiar. But this time, Sarah didn't feel wonder mixed with unease. She felt a profound, resonant understanding click into place. It wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was memory. It was love. Eleanor. Eleanor must have hummed. Sitting in this very chair, holding Thomas's hand during his illness, or later, alone in her grief, writing her letters. She must have hummed to soothe herself, to soothe him. Lullabies. Fragments of hymns. Wordless melodies born of sorrow and love. Marmalade, her constant shadow, had absorbed those sounds. Learned them. When Sarah hummed that first day, steeped in her own sadness, she'd unknowingly tapped into a well of shared comfort. His answering note wasn't mimicry, it was an echo of Eleanor's love, an echo of the comfort he'd learned to offer her, and now offered to Sarah. His song was the final gift Eleanor had left behind, imprinted on the heart of the creature who had loved her most. The note faded. Marmalade blinked slowly at Sarah, his gaze deep and knowing. He lowered his head back onto his paws, his purr starting up again, a soft, contented rumble vibrating through the chair and into Sarah's back where she leaned against it. Sarah didn't hum back this time. She reached up and gently rested her hand on his back, feeling the warmth, the steady purr, the softness of his fur. Tears welled, but they were warm tears. Tears of gratitude. For Eleanor. For Thomas. For the impossible, winding path that led a lost, grieving woman and a lost, singing cat to find each other in a neglected backyard under a bruised October sky. The snow continued to fall outside, silent and thick. Inside, surrounded by the ghosts of love and the warm, living proof of its enduring echo, Sarah felt a quiet, unshakable certainty settle into her bones. Marmalade wasn't just a cat she'd rescued. He was a legacy, a melody passed from one grieving heart to another, carried on orange fur and sung in pure, resonant notes. He was Eleanor's final, desperate act of love, and he was Sarah's unexpected salvation. The gift wasn't just his presence, it was the song that remembered love. The song that said, "Even in the deepest silence, you are not alone." He had disappeared from Eleanor's life, leaving behind a melody of sorrow. But he had reappeared in Sarah's, leaving behind a melody of connection, a melody that would forever be their shared, unspoken language. A final gift, wrapped in fur and purrs, and sung in the key of understanding. The circle was complete. The song, and the silence that held it, was finally whole. The deep winter snow blanketed the world in a hushed reverence, transforming Sarah's neglected backyard into a chapel of stillness. Inside, the radiator's steady hiss was the heartbeat of the duplex, a counterpoint to Marmalade's rumbling purr as he slept, a ginger comma curled deep in Thomas's chair, now undeniably his throne. Sarah watched him, her own breath slow and even. The frantic gray numbness of October felt like someone else's memory, a distant country she'd fled. The silence now wasn't an absence, it was a presence. Full, rich, layered with the soft sounds of a shared life. The turn of a page, the crackle of the fireplace, a small electric one she'd bought, the rhythmic sigh of a cat dreaming. Weeks had passed since she'd mailed Eleanor's letters, since she'd learned the name Marmalade, since she'd understood the profound echo in his song. The knowledge hadn't changed their daily rhythm, but it had deepened its color, like sunlight hitting stained glass. Feeding him wasn't just a chore, it was a sacrament. Brushing his thick copper fur, now gleaming with health, wasn't just grooming, it was tracing the map of a shared survival. When he pressed his head against her knee, or blinked slowly from his chair, it wasn't just affection, it was a silent acknowledgement. We remember. We are here. Together. The parcel arrived on a brittle cold morning, the kind where the air itself seems to crackle. Thick cream paper, addressed in a looping, slightly shaky hand Sarah didn't recognize. The return address was the coastal town. Sarah's hands trembled as she carried it inside, placing it on the kitchen table. Marmalade, sensing the shift in her energy, patted over, sniffing the paper cautiously, his tail held high but still. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, were two things. First, a small, faded photograph. A woman with kind, tired eyes and soft silver hair. Eleanor, sitting in the very floral armchair Marmalade now claimed. On her left, much younger, sleeker, but unmistakable with his deep green eyes and a splash of white on his chest, was Marmalade. His head was tilted back, eyes half closed in bliss, as Eleanor smiled down at him, one hand gently cupping his cheek. The love radiating from the faded image was almost tangible. A physical ache, beautiful and sharp, settled in Sarah's chest. Beneath the photo, a letter. On delicate, floral stationery, the same looping handwriting as the parcel's address. Dear Sarah, your letter, and the return of my words to Thomas, arrived like a message in a bottle cast from a shore I thought I'd lost forever. Thank you. Thank you for your kindness, your understanding, and most of all, for finding my Marmalade, my sweet, brave boy. Marjorie read your letter aloud to me. When she spoke his name, Marmalade, it was the first time in 2 years I felt something other than the hollow ache. It was like hearing a beloved, forgotten melody. The photo I enclose, it was taken by Thomas not long before he got sick. It was his favorite of us. He said it captured our secret language. You were right. Letting Marmalade go that day, opening that carrier door in the cold backyard, was the second hardest thing I've ever done. The first was losing Thomas. I thought I was sentencing Marmalade to a kinder fate than a shelter, hoping against hope someone with a gentle heart might find him. But the guilt, Sarah, the guilt has been a stone in my pocket ever since. To know he survived, that he found you, Another soul who understands the weight of silence, who sees the love beneath the fear. It lifts that stone. Not completely, but enough to breathe. Marjorie tells me the sea air is good for me. It is in its way. But your letter, the knowledge that Marmalade sings his songs, my songs, in Thomas's chair, that he has a home warmed by kindness, this is the truest medicine. You have given an old woman a piece of her heart back. You've given my boy the love I couldn't, in the end, physically provide. There is no greater gift. Please, give Marmalade a gentle stroke from me. Tell him, in whatever way cats understand, that his Eleanor remembers, that she loves him still, that his song found its way home. With a heart full of more gratitude than words can hold. Eleanor Henderson. Sarah read the letter twice, tears streaming freely, not from sorrow, but from a profound sense of connection, of a circle gently closing across miles and years. She looked at Marmalade, who had jumped onto the table, not to investigate the parcel, but to sit quietly beside her, his gaze fixed on her face. He placed one white paw gently on Eleanor's letter. "He remembers you, Eleanor," Sarah whispered, her voice thick. He never stopped. She reached out, not to the letter, but to Marmalade. She stroked the space between his ears, the spot Eleanor must have touched 1,000 times. "She loves you, Marmalade. She always did." He didn't startle. He didn't purr. He simply leaned into her touch, his green eyes holding hers with that ancient, knowing depth. Then, slowly, deliberate, he lowered his head until his forehead rested softly against the back of her hand, still resting on the letter. A gesture of benediction, a silent transmission of love from Eleanor, through him, to Sarah. The past, the present, love, the loss, the impossible gift of second chances, all flowed together in that single point of contact. The room hummed with it. That night, Sarah didn't hum. She sat in her own chair, watching the firelight dance on Marmalade's fur as he slept deeply in Thomas's chair. Eleanor's photo rested on the mantelpiece beside a small seashell Sarah had found on a walk, a nod to the coast, to Eleanor's new chapter. The spare room, her study, felt peaceful, integrated. The place for work, for reading, for memory held gently. She thought of her own journey. The raw, shattered woman who'd stared out at a gray October yard, feeling untethered, invisible, adrift in the wreckage of a love that hadn't endured. She hadn't been looking for rescue. She hadn't been looking for meaning. She'd just been breathing, surviving. And then, a pair of green eyes had pierced the gloom, a silent creature carrying his own universe of loss. Their bond hadn't been instant. It had been forged in shared silence, tentative trust, the haunting beauty of an unexplained song, the shattering terror of a remembered chair, and the raw, healing tears shed together on a rainy floor. Marmalade hadn't fixed her. That wasn't his purpose. He had witnessed her. He had mirrored her loneliness, then reflected back her capacity for connection. He had carried the echo of one woman's love and offered it as a lifeline to another. In his green eyes, Sarah hadn't just seen a cat. She'd seen resilience. The quiet, fierce will to survive abandonment, the courage to tentatively trust again after betrayal, the profound ability to love deeply, even when love meant letting go. He was a living testament to the fact that grief, while it reshapes us, doesn't have to break us. That new love, unexpected, can bloom in the cracks of the old. Their story wasn't about a magical cat or a fairy tale ending. It was about the extraordinary power of ordinary connection. It was about how two lost souls, one human, one feline, both carrying invisible wounds, could find each other in the quiet margins of life. How shared vulnerability, not perfection, builds the deepest bonds. How a simple act of presence, a paw on glass, a shared note, a head resting against a knee, can be the most profound language of all. It was about learning that home isn't always a place you find. Sometimes, it's a creature who finds you, singing a song of belonging you didn't know you needed to hear. Marmalade stirred in his sleep, stretching one paw out, his claws gently kneading the worn floral fabric of the chair. A soft sigh escaped him. Sarah smiled, a warm, peaceful fullness spreading through her chest. The future was no longer a featureless gray sky. It was the next page in a story still being written, a story filled with the soft rhythm of a cat's purr, the quiet turning of pages, the shared silence that was no longer empty, but brimming with the unspoken understanding of two hearts that had weathered their storms and found safe harbor in each other. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and deep, covering the old world, making everything clean and new and possible. Inside, by the fire's glow, a woman and a cat rested, bound not by obligation, but by a melody woven from loss, resilience, and the quiet, enduring echo of love. The song hadn't ended when Eleanor left. It had simply changed key, finding a new voice, a new heart to resonate within, a new home where it could finally peacefully rest. The melody of belonging never truly fades. It just waits for the right heart to hear it and sing back. If this journey of unexpected love, haunting echoes, and a ginger cat's healing song resonated with you, like this video, it tells us these stories matter. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because hope arrives daily, often on silent pause. Comment below, where in the world are you listening? And, have you ever been found by a melody you didn't know you needed? Share this with someone who understands the language of quiet companionship. Your presence here turns stories into connection. Thank you for being part of ours. Until the next tale unfolds,